What is the scariest thing you've ever seen in your life that you can't explain? Story 1. When I was a child, both my parents went to work early, so they would drop me off at my grandmother's to eat breakfast and go to school from there. My grandmother passed away during my junior year in high school, and I started coming straight home from school. During this time, my mother started complaining that when she got home from work, the receiver of the phone, an 80s-style corded push-button phone, next to her bed was off the base. I wasn't using the phone, but she would insist I must have, because the phone was always hung up properly when she left for work. One day I got home a little early. Now I need to pause and tell you about the layout of our apartment. From the front door, I could see directly into the living room, dining room, the door to the kitchen, and the short hallway that led to my parents' bedroom and mine. There was no other door. The windows were old-fashioned, narrow casement windows with screens, and we were on the third floor. Anyway, as soon as I walked in the door, I clearly heard two footsteps in my parents' bedroom. I dropped my school bag and foolishly ran to the bedroom. It wasn't far and took only a few seconds. When I got there, no one was inside. However, I immediately noticed that the receiver of the phone on my mother's bedside table was on the floor. It was placed so that the cord to the base was stretched out as far as it could go. I later tried to replicate the placement by shaking the table, tipping the phone, and so on. I could never get the receiver off the base that way. When I finally resorted to knocking it off with a finger, it would fall on the table or next to it. The only way I could replicate the receiver's position was to carefully stretch the cord, place it, and hold it for a few moments. It could not have gotten to that spot by accident. When I found the phone, I hung it up, and it immediately rang. I answered, and it was my dad. He asked what was wrong. I asked him why he was asking. He said he had called, apparently, just before I got home, and someone, he thought it was me, answered the phone but never said anything. He finally hung up and had been trying to call back and only got through after I hung up the phone. I've never figured out what happened. I definitely heard footsteps, and I'm just as certain there was no one there. No one passed me. The windows in the bedroom were untouched, and my parents had too much of stuff under the bed and in the closet for anyone bigger than an infant to hide in either spot. Also, after this incident, my mother never found the phone disturbed again. Story 2. I have one story, though I can't explain it. I used to work as a security guard for an office building. Every once in a while I'd do my rounds, building completely empty except for me. Then I'd sit at the security desk and watch the cameras. But then the CFO would suddenly appear on the cameras, on the first floor. He would literally just appear in his office, even after I had checked and confirmed it was empty. He'd walk around the first floor for a bit, go back to his office, and completely disappear again. I'd go around the first floor, but I'd never see him in person. I only ever saw him on the cameras. It used to scare me a lot. I ended up recording the CCTV and showed the footage to the security supervisor, which led to HR questioning him about sneaking into the office after hours. Turned out, behind some filing cabinets in his office, there was this little hatch door that led to a vertical passageway with a ladder connected to the basement. The guy had gotten divorced the month before and lost his house. He was living in that tiny passageway with a sleeping bag. Story 3. It was around 1998, and my family had just moved into an old clapboard house on the edge of town. It had a huge backyard with a 6-foot wooden privacy fence on one side and a metal chain-link fence about 4.5 feet high around the other 3 sides. We had neighbors on the privacy fence side, a small grass alley that ran behind the back with a street light, and then another yard beyond. Our bedroom was an old converted sunroom at the back of the house facing the yard. It had floor-to-ceiling windows all along the back wall. We didn't have many options for bed placement, so my headboard was against the windows, and my brother's bed was about 8 feet away, with his headboard against the opposite wall and the foot of his bed facing the windows. One night we were up pretty late. I was in my bed, and he was in his, just talking about random things when suddenly he went quiet. I figured he'd fallen asleep, but then I heard him whispering in a shaky voice. I asked, "What?" And he whispered again. I said, "Oh, speak up. I can't hear you." And then he goes, "Don't move and be quiet," in a forced whisper. Thinking he was just messing with me, I said, "Why?" while looking at him. Mind you, my head was toward the windows, and he was pointing into the backyard behind me. I quickly sat up and turned around, and saw this huge dog head staring almost nose to glass through the window right behind my bed. I was almost nose to nose with it, separated only by a single pane of glass and about 10 inches of air. When I say I screamed, I mean I screamed. Not my proudest moment, but hey, I was like 10 years old. The thing quickly ducked under the window, then ran to the side of the yard and jumped the 4.5-foot chain link fence, bolting into the darkness. My dad came running into the room with my mom right behind him. We managed to get out that something had been looking through our window. My dad ran to his room, grabbed his shotgun, and headed out the side door into the backyard. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, he didn't find anything. He assumed I had a nightmare, and since my brother wouldn't admit to seeing anything, I got blamed and was told to stop messing around and go to bed. Typical parent response. Later that night, maybe an hour later, after begging my parents to let me sleep in the living room and still being refused, I was made to sleep in my room. So once again, my brother and I were in our room with the giant windows, completely rattled. We were both huddled in his bed, staring out the windows when we saw the thing again, walking along the chain link fence on all fours. The fence only reached its mid-shoulder, so this thing was huge. It sniffed the ground, did a few circles, then hopped the fence into our backyard like it was nothing. It walked over to the window again and pressed its nose to the glass like it was trying to see in. We were panicking the entire time. Then my brother muttered, "Forget this!" And as soon as he stepped off the bed, we heard a loud bang and saw a flash of light. The thing at the window was knocked sideways but instantly turned and ran across the entire backyard, jumped the chain link fence, cleared the alleyway, landed in the neighbor's yard, and disappeared in a dead sprint beside their house and into the darkness. That was a 15 to 20-foot jump at least, clearing fences like it was nothing. My dad came tearing around the house with his shotgun, made a mad dash for the side door, and slammed it shut behind him. He was yelling that we had to leave. We packed up and stayed at a hotel that night. My mom refused to believe what we said we saw. We only lived in that house for 6 months. It rattled my dad so much that he didn't even want to go back. He told my mom we were moving the next day, but she didn't agree, until 6 months later when she finally gave in. Mind you, this was in the coastal plains region of Texas. We don't have large wild canines here, just stray dogs and coyotes, but nothing that came close to what we saw. My dad swears he shot that thing from about 15 feet away with a 12-gauge shotgun slug right under its left arm into the ribs where the vital organs are. And still, it just ran off. He said the most disturbing part was seeing it crouch walk on its hind legs toward our window. It wasn't walking on all fours at that point. When it reached the window, it stood up straighter, and he said that while it looked like a dog, its body was shaped wrong. He said it looked like a really stocky person wearing a dog costume, but it clearly wasn't a costume. And when it had been sniffing the ground earlier, he noticed it wasn't actually following a scent. It was just staring at our window with its face pointed down, like it was pretending to sniff, almost as if it was trying to play a role and see if anyone would notice. He said he's had dogs all his life, and nothing about this creature's behavior was normal. Later, I asked my dad why he went into the backyard if he thought it was just a nightmare. He told me my brother gave it away. He said I looked panicked, but my brother was pale as a sheet and wouldn't take his eyes off the window. He said, "Your brother has never looked so scared and has never been one to make things up." So after going back to bed with my mom, he couldn't shake it. He grabbed his gun and decided to check the yard from the far side of the house in case someone really was out there. He never expected to see what he saw. But when he saw the creature jump the fence and walk toward our window, illuminated by the street light in the back alley, he said he felt this overwhelming dread, like something terrible was about to happen to us. Story 4. I went to college in Providence, Rhode Island. My dorm room was shared with a roommate. We had beds on opposite sides and desks at the foot of each bed, the usual dorm setup. One day my boyfriend and I were hanging out in my room. He was lying on my bed while I bent down to grab something. Suddenly, he screamed and grabbed his eyes, visibly shaken. He wouldn't tell me why at first. Eventually, he said that when I bent over, he saw a shadow behind me that looked exactly like him, and it freaked him out. He had an afro, so the silhouette would have been very distinctive. We didn't talk about it much afterward, and we never told my roommate. She wasn't in the room at the time. A couple of weeks later, I was asleep in bed with my boyfriend. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw my roommate packing a bag, clearly panicked. She rushed out of the room and didn't notice I was awake. so I didn't say anything. The next morning, I asked her why she left in such a hurry in the middle of the night. She told me she had woken up and saw my boyfriend sitting at my desk, so she asked him why he was up, only to realize he was actually still asleep next to me. She believed in paranormal stuff, so she completely freaked out and left. That really shook me because we had never told her about the look-alike my boyfriend saw. Yet somehow, she described the exact same thing. Living in Rhode Island really exposed me to some unexplainable stuff. Story 5. My very first job was as a radio DJ at a small hometown radio station in the mid-1990s. This was a tiny building out in the middle of a field with a 500-foot antenna out back and a single road from the main road to the front door. The transmitter was right behind my studio, behind sound-dampening glass, and had a light bulb that was always on. The station was so small that you could see the light bulb in the transmitter room all the way from the driveway. There were only two doors, the front door and the back door in the transmitter room. That back door didn't even have a handle on the outside, and it was always locked from the inside. It was impossible to enter through that door from the outside. I worked the evening shift from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. After my shift, we actually went off the air for the night. I was always the last person there, so after I went off the air, I had to pull commercials for the first hour or two of the morning show, clean dishes, finish up some production work, etc. After working there for a year or so, I had racked up a couple of strange experiences. Shadows scurrying about in the corner of my vision, lights turning off and on. One evening, after getting in and taking over the board, I was just sitting there preparing myself mentally for the next 5 hours. I looked up, out the studio doors toward the front door, and saw the perfect shadow shape of a man who was probably 6 feet tall. It was there, then gone. I went to my boss, who wasn't the friendliest person on her best days, and said, "So, I have a weird question." She sighed and looked at me, clearly expecting something annoying. "Have you ever felt like someone was here who wasn't?" My boss yelled across the building for someone to come into her office. When that person arrived, she tilted her head at me and said, "He's seen Jimmy." Supposedly, everyone had seen Jimmy, the original owner of the radio station. He popped in from time to time. "He won't hurt you. He's just checking in on the station." So, from then on, Jimmy would make his appearances. His presence was harmless. My studio faced another unused studio, and he would flash the lights on and off a few times. I'd say, "Hi, Jimmy. Everything's going well," and it would stop. He turned on a water faucet once. He whispered my name in my ear one night, which freaked me out. At least I think it was him. You see, there was another presence in the station, one that didn't feel so harmless. It didn't have a name and was about shin high. This one always gave me a really bad feeling. It would dart beside me, just in the corner of my eye. I always knew it was there because I'd get that overwhelming sense of dread. One night in particular was the scariest I've ever experienced. Here it is, 30 years later, and I still can't explain it. As soon as everyone left the building for the night, I felt it, like it was there. I turned on all the lights, turned the music up, and tried to ignore it. But the longer the night went on, the worse it got. Lights were flashing everywhere. A dot matrix printer in the sales office started running on its own, which never happened, and that office was locked. Then ceiling tiles started moving upward, as if someone hit them from below with a broom handle. They started closest to me, in my studio, down the hall, and ended at the front door, which was locked. Then the front door opened. A locked door opened on its own. I went down the hall to close and relock it. When I did, I saw through the door's window that there was a coffee cup and a cigar sitting on the front stoop. There was no reason for them to be there. On my way back to the studio, I was hit with a strong burst of cigar smell, like I'd walked into a cloud of invisible smoke. I knew I still had duties to finish, but I didn't care anymore. I went off the air, grabbed my keys, and got out of there. I ran to my car, backed up, and looked through the front door. A figure was standing inside, silhouetted against the transmitter light. I peeled out and went straight home. Now, all of that is bizarre, but it's not the most unexplainable part. Is it 100% impossible that someone didn't sneak in and pull off a very elaborate prank? There's a slight minuscule chance, but to this day, I don't know how. It was an old, tiny building. Still, I've kept the possibility open that it might have been a prank. I got home and told my mom the whole story. My heart was still pounding. She just said, "Well, it's bedtime." So I went to my room and dialed up a BBS to write someone about what had happened. As I was typing, my modem's speaker turned on. If you're old enough to remember dial-up modems, you know that the speaker doesn't just turn on once the connection is made. Even if someone picked up the phone in the house, it wouldn't cause the speaker to come back on. It would just corrupt the connection. The speaker turned on, and a voice came through mixed with the static of the data. It screeched, "Help me!" Then the speaker shut off and nothing else changed on my screen. That sound, that moment, is burned into my brain. I remember the screech like it was yesterday. I have no explanation for it. My mom was the only other person in the house, and she wouldn't and couldn't have done something like that. It was the scariest night of my life. I'm as skeptical as they come when it comes to ghosts or UFOs. But that night was beyond anything I can explain. As kind of a footnote, I go back to that station now and then when I visit home. I still know people who work there. Jimmy is still active and well known by the staff. That little shadow figure? No one else has reported seeing it. Story 6. At one of my previous sysadmin jobs, we were shutting down one of our smaller data centers as it was being consolidated into a larger facility. But someone still had to be on site overnight in case any server issues came up that required physical intervention. We rotated weekly who would take the overnight shifts there. The place had a reputation for being haunted, though I never really knew by what. It was just a rumor passed around by coworkers when I got hired. Imagine a relatively large open office space, now completely empty of all its cubicles, desks, and people, except for one desk in the center and a few random cables still hanging from the ceiling. Only the lights over my desk worked, casting a glow that bled about 3 feet into the surrounding darkness. That was my setup for the week. I remember sitting there, hearing the distant ambient noise of the server room, the fans, cooling system, etc., while working on a client server, when I saw something dart across the room in my peripheral vision. I looked up and didn't see anything, so I figured my eyes were just tired from the screen glare. I went back to work. About 5 minutes later, I saw it again. Only this time, I also heard the bathroom door open and shut. It was one of those big, heavy doors you had to pull open, and then a mechanism would pull it closed behind you. I thought maybe one of my coworkers had come in for a server issue, so I got up and waited for them to come out. 10 minutes passed and no one came out. I walked into the bathroom to make sure no one had passed out or had a medical issue. One of my coworkers had a history of seizures, but the bathroom was empty. Now I was officially creeped out. I left the bathroom, and this time, I saw the shadow figure on the other side of the room. This time, not in my peripheral vision, but straight on as it darted across the space. I quickly turned on the rest of the lights and started searching the entire office and server room, certain that someone was messing with me. I never found anyone. The rest of that night was uneventful, as was the rest of the week. Aside from me basically sitting at my desk the whole time, on edge, waiting for something else to happen. Story 7. I've shared this story on Reddit before, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. It's not exactly a scary thing I saw, but I still wonder about it all the time, so I'll copy and paste it here. My best friend and I used to always talk about crazy dreams we had. We never thought much of it until he told me about one where he got hit by a car and died. We were about 15 or 16 when he told me the dream. We were into conspiracies, aliens, paranormal, lucid dreaming, so we talked about stuff like that a lot. He died right before he would have turned 20. He said he was riding a skateboard, wearing all black, when the car hit him. He could see everyone at his funeral. He even said his crush was there and laughed about it. He just kept going on about how real it felt, and it really shook me up, until eventually I forgot about it. Then a few years later, after I had long forgotten the dream he told me about, it happened for real. His crush was at the funeral. He did get hit by a car and died. He was wearing all black, his work clothes, and he was riding my skateboard. It was all true. I still don't know what to make of it. Every single detail I remember from his dream came true, and I'm sure there were parts he told me that I don't even remember. I felt crazy. I didn't tell anyone about it. I just don't know how or why he saw it happen in his dream, and I keep wondering what if he had never told me. It left me with so many questions. But I guess now I have proof, at least to myself, that our souls go on after we die. I just wish I knew why he had that dream and why he told me. There had to be some kind of reason. I just keep thinking how I wouldn't believe this story if I hadn't experienced it myself. Story 8. There was this abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, like 30 minutes of back roads to find it, and no other people for at least 10 miles in any direction. My friends and I used to go check out this spooky house and show it off to one or two new people at a time. We did this 3 or 4 times, and one night, as we were pulling up, a light inside the house turned on. The house didn't have power any of the times we'd been there before, and there were no vehicles anywhere around it that night. It scared us so much that none of us ever went back. In retrospect, it was probably being used as a hunting cabin or a hidden place like a meth lab, although we never saw anything that indicated that. And maybe they just had the breaker turned off when they weren't there. A car could have been parked somewhere behind the house where we couldn't see it from the road. But as high school kids, no way. To us, it was just a creepy house with unexplained lights. Story 9. When I was 9 years old, I was biking home in the evening. We lived in the countryside, up a small mountain. The road from the village was an uphill, a flat section, and then another uphill. The streetlights only went as far as the flat section. I was a bit afraid of the dark, so I stopped at the end of the lit area, just at the bottom of the last hill, to gather my courage to bike the last stretch home. It was a partial moon, so it wasn't pitch black. At the top of the hill, I saw a figure walking down toward me. I thought I'd wait until they got closer. Maybe I'd feel less afraid if someone else was near. But about halfway down the hill, the person walked into a thin shadow from a tree across the road and never came out, just disappeared. I stood there for a while trying to figure out what I had just seen, and then panicked and biked back to the village. I stayed there until my parents came driving and wondered why I never made it home. They tried to explain it. Maybe the person went into the woods or something. What they didn't tell me then, because they were afraid I'd never bike home again, was that my father had seen the same thing walking home from work. He saw her clearly, walking down the hill. When he looked away for just a second, she was gone, and there were no footsteps in the fresh snow. Later, I read a book about local legends. Apparently, for over a century, people have reported seeing her walk down that hill and disappear halfway down. My youngest daughter loves the story, so we go on ghost stakeouts, buy pizzas and snacks, hang out at the bottom of the hill, listen to the Ghostbusters theme song, and try to see the ghost. Storytime. Once, when I was around 12 years old, I was riding my bike on the trails near a golf course. There are high-tension power lines going through the park, so a clearing cuts through the forest. A car pulled into the clearing, and I noticed the back seat was full, but only the driver was visible up front. They stopped, everyone got out, and they dragged a guy screaming out of the back seat. They beat him up a little and shot him twice, once in the gut, for pain, I guess, and once in the head. Then they stuffed the body back into the car, everyone climbed back in just like before, and they drove away. I stayed hidden in the brush, frozen and terrified, until they were out of sight. I went over to where the car had been. No mess. Just tire tracks and footprints. It was like it hadn't happened at all. I rode home and didn't tell anyone what I had seen. After dinner, everyone went off to do their own thing, so I went to my parents' bedroom to use the phone. I called 911, told them I wanted to stay anonymous, and reported what I saw. They thanked me, and I hung up. I never heard anything about it on the news. They must have done a good job hiding the body. But I still think it's strange that I couldn't see any signs of what had just happened, right in front of me. I've carried this memory of witnessing a murder for nearly 40 years now, and I think it's influenced how I see everything. Story 11. About 25 years ago, my then wife and I were caretaking a house. We'd been there for several weeks, and we both noticed that we always had this feeling, coming up the stairs from the cellar, that something was going to grab us as soon as we turned off the light switch. Everything else about the house was normal. We slept with an old analog wind-up alarm clock next to the bed, the kind that actually ticks. To set the alarm, you move a small third hand to the desired time. For example, halfway between 6 and 7 for a 6:30 wake-up. It's a physical action, and it's hard to get it wrong. We always had the clock set to wake us up at 6 a.m. It wasn't something we adjusted daily. One night, the alarm went off at around 2 a.m. Old school ringing bells. We both woke up completely terrified. I saw a small figure, maybe 2 feet tall, run out of the room. I thought I must have been imagining things until my wife screamed, "Did you just see that thing?" We both described it as some sort of small gremlin. When we looked at the alarm clock, we saw that the alarm hand had been moved from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. That's the whole story. It scared us badly. We never experienced anything else like that there, but that feeling in the cellar never went away. Story 12. In college, I studied in the UK. I lived in a house with a group of other American students, and there were stories about the ghost of a girl who had died while living there. I never really believed any of it, but it was fun to play along. The kitchen had one way in and out, and right after you entered, there was a padlocked door to the cellar on the right, where she supposedly lived. I had the only key. Around Thanksgiving, we were all feeling homesick and decided to cook a meal together. Because the kitchen appliances were small, we had to schedule our cooking in shifts. One girl who didn't have class the next day offered to stay up late and start the turkey. That night was the first and only time we went into the cellar to get some larger cooking tools. At 2:04 in the morning, I woke up to my door rattling, like someone was lightly pushing against it. I assumed it was a housemate who had the wrong door. About 30 seconds later, I heard a scratchy female voice softly saying, "Hello," every few seconds. My window was open, and it sounded like the voice was coming from outside. I got up to close it, thinking maybe it was a drunk girl walking back from a pub, but there was no one there. Then I heard, "Hello," again, clear as a bell, behind me. My door rattled again, and then silence. I've had night terrors before, and I hallucinate when I have even a mild fever, so I assumed I was dreaming and laid back down. The next morning at 7 a.m., the girl who had stayed up cooking said, "I had the creepiest night. At 1:50, I heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. Then the door rattled. Then at 2:10, the door rattled again, and I heard footsteps going back down." She told me this before I'd said a single word about what happened to me. Story 13. My mom and I were driving up from Texas to Washington in late October. We stopped to rest in this national park in southern Colorado, and were pretty much the only people there. It was usually daylight when we stopped to rest because my mom preferred driving at night. We were sitting there making something to eat when this guy on a bicycle went past us and glared at us with these hate-filled eyes. My mom and I were pretty creeped out by him, but went on with what we were doing, then laid down in the car to sleep. Her in the front and my boxer and I in the back seat. I got this feeling like I was being watched, and then my dog's hackles went up and she started this really deep kind of growl, the kind she only made when she was truly bothered by something. I reached over and chambered a round in my shotgun. My mom heard it and said, "Hey, are you awake? Do you want to get out of here?" And I said, "Hell yeah, I do." We got up and I stood guard with my shotgun and the dog while she packed everything into the car. We couldn't see him, but we could both feel that he was watching us, and the dog didn't settle down until we'd left that place far behind. We made a beeline for Moab and stopped at a truck stop to rest instead. When we got up, we went in to grab something to eat and met a really friendly trucker. We told him what had happened. He shadowed us north for quite a while and then handed us off to other truckers. They shadowed us all the way to Idaho. They were all a great bunch of people for sure. Story 14. Roughly 15 years ago, I was in upstate New York with my uncle at our family house. It's a quiet place. Not many people around. My uncle and I were outside when it started to pour, so we went inside. We were standing by the front door looking out, and my uncle was commenting on how hard it was raining. It's pretty rural, so it was mostly pitch black outside except for the front house light illuminating the yard. As we were watching the rain, we both saw someone speed walking down the road. It was so dark, but their skin was incredibly pale. We could see their hands moving, and then their face as they turned toward our house. All I remember is that the face had no eyes. My uncle quickly shut the door and said not to worry. It was probably someone who got caught in the rain. I was scared, but he calmed me down. I was little, so I don't remember much after that, except that my uncle kept watch for a while. I actually forgot about this story until years later when I brought it up to him, thinking maybe it was a dream. His attitude changed instantly. He just said he remembered, but didn't want to talk about it. I've never brought it up again, and to this day, when I think about it, I get a really eerie feeling. Story 15. I worked in a nursing home for years during the night shift. Everyone always complained about weird stuff happening, especially noises from the top floor. I never believed in any of that, so I was always the one who volunteered to do the night checks. One night, I was changing a resident on that floor with a colleague when he said he heard something, like people walking. We were inside the resident's room, and I had to go to the cupboard at the end of the corridor to get bed sheets. As I was walking back with the sheets, I kept hearing footsteps and the sound of someone rustling plastic bags. I was so annoyed, thinking someone was messing around. I looked out of the room and saw a shadow passing through the corridor. The problem was, the shadow was huge, like a full-size person, and it moved along with the sound of steps and plastic being touched. I froze completely. I was so terrified I had to call another colleague to come upstairs. I couldn't bring myself to leave the resident's room. Keep in mind, I never believed in any of that stuff. For 2 years, I did night checks on the top and bottom floors all by myself, and I never had any issues. But after that night, I never went upstairs alone again. I was always scared after that. Story 16. This isn't my story, it's my uncle's. A bit of backstory. He used to work on the London Underground doing maintenance on the tracks and tunnels. One time, he went into a tunnel with two other colleagues. They had stopped to work on something when a man said to my uncle, "Hey, uncle's name, can you show me the way out?" My uncle assumed it was one of the guys in his team and replied, "You know the way out." He was so focused on his task that he didn't turn around at first. Then the man said, "I'm so cold." At that moment, my uncle said he suddenly felt freezing. The air around him changed. He turned around and shone his light on the man, and that's when he saw him. He described him as a ghost. The man was holding a really old-fashioned lamp and wearing a dirty, outdated uniform. My uncle said he could just tell this man wasn't alive. The man kept repeating, "I'm so cold, I'm so cold." My uncle eventually said, "I don't think you're supposed to be here, mate. Can you see a light anywhere?" The man looked directly at him and said, "Can you help me? I'm so cold." One of my uncle's colleagues came over, thinking maybe it was someone on the team playing a joke. But when he approached the man, he disappeared right in front of their eyes. They all freaked out and ran. None of them would go back into that tunnel again. Some of their other colleagues said they also saw the same figure, and every time, he says the same thing about being cold. My uncle's retired now, but he says he still thinks about that man from time to time. Story 17. I was about 12 at the time. Every year, my parents and I would drive from Montreal to Nova Scotia to visit family. Having always taken the Trans-Canada route, we decided to go through the States for a change. We ended up heading southeast through Maine and eventually into New Brunswick, then Nova Scotia. I remember we were in a very remote area, hadn't seen a house for a very long time. This was before GPS or Google Maps, so there was a growing concern in the car that we might run out of gas. I don't remember the name of the road, but it was a narrow country road with a mountain on the right side that went straight up through dense woods. On the left side, it was also thick forest and a steep downhill where I could make out a river at the bottom of the cliff, probably 75 to 100 feet down. Trees hung over the road, so even though it was a sunny day, the road was mostly in shade except for a few places where the sun broke through. I heard my dad ask my mom, "What the heck is that up ahead?" I leaned over to look down the road and saw what looked like a man in the distance, standing on the side of the road. Too far to make out any details, just a big dark figure. As we rolled closer, this person crossed the road, both lanes in what I swear was 3 or 4 steps. Then once it reached the other side, it just vanished into the woods. When we got to the spot where it had crossed, my dad slowed down and looked around. Nothing. No sign of anyone. No trail. Just gone. We never figured out what we saw, but 30 years later, it still comes up in conversation every few years. The feelings are always mutual, unexplainable, creepy, and weird. Story 18. Back in college, my girlfriend and I would go back to her parents' old farmhouse to hang out after class. There was never anybody home. One afternoon, I was standing in the kitchen, thirstily guzzling a post-intimacy Gatorade. Behind me was a back staircase leading up to the second floor of the house. When I finished my drink and turned to leave the room, I saw a little girl, probably around 7 to 10 years old, standing on the bottom step. My first thought was, "Oh no, why didn't my girlfriend tell me there was a child in the house?" I really hoped she didn't hear what we were up to. But before I could say anything, I realized something was off. She was semi-transparent and oddly two-dimensional in a way that's hard to describe. Slowly, I came to the realization that I was staring at a ghost. There was nothing inherently frightening about it. Knowing I was in the presence of something unexplainable, I tried my best not to blink. I stared at her for a good 10 to 15 seconds, taking in every detail. She wore a red and yellow summer dress. She had long blonde hair tied into two old-fashioned braids, black strapped shoes. The overall look gave off a 1940 to 1970 vibe. Fortunately, she didn't seem to notice I was there. She just stood on the bottom step, looking out the back window toward the driveway, like she was waiting for someone to arrive. I never took my eyes off her, and eventually she was just gone. I never believed in ghosts before that. I still don't fully believe in intelligent hauntings, but I'm definitely open to the idea of residual energy or echoes of the past. That moment changed something in how I think about the world. Story 19. Let me start by saying I'm on the fence about paranormal stuff. I'd like to believe there's something out there, but I also try to find a logical explanation for everything first. I'll always go through every possible reason before considering something paranormal. That said, my old family home was always a bit off. It just had a heavy, uncomfortable atmosphere. No matter how much we tried to make it feel like home, it never really did, even after 12 years. It was a very old place, 200-plus-year-old terraced houses knocked together in West Yorkshire, complete with a creepy coal cellar. Strangely, we only had access to one half of the cellar. The other half was walled off, with a single brick removed for ventilation. At night, I'd often lie awake hearing footsteps walking up and down the landing. It wasn't my parents. I knew their footsteps. And it wasn't my younger sisters, because the steps were too heavy. The sounds would move from the top of the stairs, stop outside my room, and then walk back. It creeped me out that I never saw a shadow under the door. There were also voices and bangs in other rooms when no one else was home. Not the kind of noises you chalk up to neighbors or the house settling. The scariest thing that ever happened was one night shortly after we got our first family dog. I was in the living room watching TV with my dad. Because the house was made of two connected homes, one side of the downstairs was the living room, and the other side was the kitchen, dining area. There were doors at both ends. You could walk a full circle around the downstairs. We were just relaxing. The dog was laying by the radiator under the front window. Suddenly, we heard a huge bang, the sound of the back door slamming shut and rattling. The impact was so strong, we actually felt the vibration. A few seconds later, the dog started barking furiously at the hallway. I went to see what was going on, and the front door was wide open. There was no one outside, no way someone could have opened it and run without us seeing or hearing. I checked the back door, completely locked with the chain on. That incident freaked me out. I refused to stay home alone for a couple of weeks after that. No explanation ever made sense. Story 20. I was driving home with my family late after a day of skiing. My father likes to drive a bit too fast for the weather conditions, and it had just started to snow heavily. We hit a patch of black ice, spun out, and started sliding toward what looked like a 30 to 40-foot almost vertical drop into a wooded area. Before we reached the edge, the section between the front and rear passenger side doors suddenly crumpled inward, enough for us to see outside, stopping us right on the shoulder of the road. The weird part is, when we got out, there was nothing there to hit. No guardrails, no street signs, no posts, absolutely nothing. What made it even stranger was that it didn't feel like a crash. I've been in accidents before, and this was nothing like that. We went from 65 miles per hour to a dead stop with the same force you'd feel pulling into a parking space. No jolt, no bang, just spinning, then an immediate stop. Another foot, and we would have gone over the edge, and likely wouldn't have survived. When we looked at the car, it looked like something out of an Avengers movie. The damage was as if Iron Man had reached out and stopped the car with his hand. It's hard to describe, but I'm convinced something beyond explanation stepped in to stop us. Story 21. I'm not typically one to believe in the supernatural, but something happened to me a few years ago that I still can't explain. Even thinking about it now gives me chills, and I often wonder if anyone else has experienced something similar. Here's what happened. I was on a road trip with a couple of friends headed to a small town known for its scenic mountains and forests. We planned to camp in a clearing not far off the main trail, just to watch the stars and escape the city for a few days. Everything went well. We arrived just before dusk, set up our tents, and got a fire going. It was peaceful and exactly what we were looking for, completely isolated. Around midnight, the conversation began to fade. The forest was silent except for the crackle of our fire. We were about to turn in when I suddenly heard faint, distant music. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but my friend looked around too. I asked him, "Do you hear that?" And he nodded, looking just as confused as I was. We strained our ears trying to figure out where it was coming from, and realized the sound came from deeper in the forest, beyond where the firelight reached. It was a melodic humming, almost like a lullaby. The strangest part was how it echoed around us, like we were inside a large, hollow space. We figured maybe some other campers had a radio, but it didn't sound like any modern music. It was haunting and beautiful, but deeply unsettling. We considered investigating, but ultimately decided not to. It was late, we were unfamiliar with the terrain, and we didn't have enough light. So we just sat there listening, hoping the music would stop. But it didn't. It kept going and even grew louder, like it was getting closer. But we couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the fire. Then things got weirder. The fire suddenly dimmed and the whole clearing turned cold, like all the warmth was pulled from the air. The music was now clearer, coming from all directions. My friend whispered, "I think we should go back to the car." I didn't need convincing. We grabbed the essentials, left the rest, and made our way back to the trail. As we walked, the music followed us, fading in and out like something was pacing us through the trees. At one point I saw movement, just a flicker of a shadow in the branches, but it didn't match anything natural. We reached the car, locked the doors, and drove to the nearest town without looking back. The next morning we returned for our gear. Everything was where we left it, but the clearing felt different, like something had been disturbed. Even in daylight, it felt like we weren't alone. We've tried to rationalize it, maybe strange echoes or someone else camping, but no one in town had seen or heard anything unusual that night. The nearest known campsite was miles away. I've asked other hikers and campers if they've ever experienced anything like that, and while some had spooky stories, no one described anything like this. Maybe it was some kind of group hallucination, but we all heard the music, we all felt the cold, and none of us can explain it. Story 22. In 2002, I came home from college to the Cincinnati area and met up with a couple of high school friends. We were driving around northern Kentucky around 9 p.m. It was unusually foggy that night, low-hanging clouds, and the tops of the hills were completely hidden in mist. I was in the back seat while my two friends were in the front. Just after we crossed a bridge, I saw a light up in the fog. At first, I thought it was a helicopter, but that didn't make any sense. It was way too foggy for any helicopter to be flying. There would have been zero visibility. I pointed it out, and my friends saw it too, but they couldn't get a good view from the front. I had the clearest angle looking through the back window, so I kept describing what I saw. They eventually pulled over. We watched for a bit, but then the light disappeared. After waiting a couple minutes, we decided to keep moving. A few minutes later, the light reappeared. It was brighter now and seemed to be getting closer to the hilltop, right to the edge of the fog. And then it happened. I saw the edge of a round, dark object emerge from the cloud cover and hover there for a moment. It reminded me of that moment in The Shining when Jack Torrance sticks his face through the door. Just sudden and jarring. I couldn't see where the lights were coming from. They were still hidden behind the fog. But I was definitely looking at a large, dark, rounded surface. My mind immediately went to UFO. To this day, I have no logical explanation. A blimp is the closest thing I could compare it to. But this thing disappeared back into the clouds, and the lights shut off completely. I didn't think much about it afterward, just chalked it up as strange, until years later when I saw the movie Nope. I had a mini panic attack in the theater. The imagery in that movie was eerily similar to what I saw that night. Story 23. Around a year ago, I moved into a new apartment. It was in a nice area, had a good amount of space, and at first glance nothing seemed wrong. But very soon, just a couple of days after moving in, that place started to feel really off. I had this unexplainable sense of dread and felt like I wasn't welcome, almost as if the apartment itself hated me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My mental health declined rapidly, I already had OCD, and I developed an eating disorder from the stress shortly after moving in. I want to be clear that my conditions don't cause hallucinations or delusions. I've always been skeptical of the paranormal. I think it's cool, but I usually look for logical explanations. The feeling of being watched and unwelcome persisted the entire time I lived there. The strangest moment was when I saw, clear as day, a shadow-like silhouette of a man in the hallway. His upper body and head were clearly visible, but below the mid-torso, it was a blur. He stood there for a second or two and then vanished. What I remember most is how he just stood there, a little hunched over, kind of at a side angle, head tilted slightly toward me. He looked like an actual person with a lazy posture. Recently, I asked a friend who had visited that apartment once if he noticed anything strange, without giving any details. His response, "Oh yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that place was haunted. It felt weird." And he's not someone who usually buys into paranormal stuff. After about 6 months, I moved out. My new apartment is in another city, and honestly, it's a lot worse in terms of size and surroundings, but I'm much happier. The constant dread is gone. I even recovered from the eating disorder not long after moving. So yeah, maybe that place had invisible mold or something messing with me. Whatever it was, I'm glad to be out of there. Godspeed to whoever lives there now. I hope they don't see the Shadow Man. Story 24. About 12 years ago, when I was in my teens, my friend's dad drove us to a place known as Devil's Hill. It was famous for a massive hill people used to speed over, and the area had a reputation for being haunted. There was also a really creepy old church nearby. We drove there one night, but the back entrance was completely blocked off with concrete barriers. So we circled around to the opposite side of the hill. The area was in the early stages of being developed into a housing estate. Partial builds were scattered throughout, all fenced off. As we were halfway up the road on the other side of the hill, a massive crowd suddenly appeared out of the bushes. They looked like members of a cult, dressed in full robes, very much resembling KKK-style outfits. The strangest part was how they appeared. It didn't look like people emerging from the bushes. One second the road was completely empty, and the next there were 50-plus figures just standing there in front of us. We immediately threw the car into reverse, backed into a fence, and sped away. To this day, I still can't explain what we saw, but we all saw it, and it still comes up in conversation now and then. Story 25. I grew up in a haunted house in Canada from the age of 7 to 18, so I've seen and experienced many things I can't explain. I mention this because it gives context to something that happened just last week. That house in Canada was undeniably haunted. Doors would slam, orbs appeared, shadows moved, electronics would malfunction. It had it all. Whatever was there didn't seem malicious, more playful than anything, especially when we were kids. I was never really scared, just confused sometimes. Last week, my wife and I flew to York, UK. It's a lovely town, made even more special by the people who care for it. We spent 3 days exploring, shopping, and drinking pints with the locals. One of the shops we visited was a 4-story antique store near the Minster. The first floor was fascinating, old housewares. Second floor was vinyl records. Third floor held curiosities from all over the world. Then we reached the fourth floor, and everything changed. As we stepped onto that level, it felt like I walked straight into the saddest, angriest place I've ever been. One wall held World War I medals, the other World War II medals, and in the middle of the room was a rocking horse. I don't know what it was, who or what had left an imprint there, but the darkness in that room was overwhelming. I panicked and ran. I left my wife behind, sprinted down the stairs, and sat on the steps outside waiting for her. When she finally came out, she asked, "What's wrong with you?" Then added, "Yeah, you felt that too?" The rocking horse started rocking when you ran. That's when I decided I won't ever be going back there. Story 26. My grandparents own a very old, large mansion that my 3 siblings and I spent a lot of time in growing up. Each of us had our own bedroom. One night, my sister begged me to sleep in her room because she was scared. We were both watching TV when I suddenly saw a woman with long dark hair wearing a sundress walk from the library, past my sister's doorframe, and down the hall. I jumped up and rushed to the hallway just in time to see her glance back at me, round the corner, and vanish. My sister ran over and slammed the door in front of my face. She was nearly in tears, saying, "She'll be back. Please don't open the door. I don't want to see her again." The door had a large square hole where a metal grate used to be for ventilation, but at the time it had been removed for cleaning. Several times that night, I saw the woman's legs walk past the door through that opening. To this day, my sister refuses to talk about what happened. Once the grate was put back on the door, she kicked me out of her room and never asked me to stay over again. Story 27. This happened almost 20 years ago and is definitely the strangest, and at the time scariest thing that ever happened to me. I was hanging out in my parents' basement, gaming. This was peak Halo 2 era. I was home alone and got off the couch to grab a snack or something. As I was heading toward the stairs, I suddenly felt what I can only describe as an electric current shoot up my spine. It was instant, intense, and only happened once. I'd never felt anything like it before, so I quickly took off my shirt to check myself. I noticed a red mark forming on my right shoulder, and as I kept looking, the shape started to change. Within seconds, it had formed perfectly into a red handprint, like someone had slapped me hard on the back. It disappeared just as quickly as it came, leaving me in absolute shock. My grandfather had passed away about a week before this happened. We were really close, so I've always taken that moment as a sign from him, like he was letting me know he was still with me. If it wasn't him, I have no explanation. This has never happened to me again. Story 28. In the 1980s, there was a derelict hotel near where I lived in East London called the Galleons. It was terrifying, built in the 1800s, complete with gargoyles and everything. Look it up. All the neighborhood kids used to dare each other to go to the third floor, bang on the corrugated iron blocking the windows, and run back down in almost complete darkness. One day during the school holidays, about 6 of us went over there to mess around. We'd been inside for hours and had literally searched the whole place using stolen workman's lamps. You know, the ones with real oil and an open flame. The hotel was trashed, empty, and had been vandalized for decades. My younger brother, who was 13 at the time, joined us later. He had never been inside, so my friend and I took him in to go up to the dreaded third floor. The only way in was through the cellar, which let in a bit of daylight. But once you reached the ground floor, it was completely dark. I suggested we sit on the stairs for a minute to let our eyes adjust, since the oil lamps barely gave off more than an orange glow. As we sat there, we heard footsteps coming down the wooden staircase from the floor above us. No mistaking it, clear creaks and the clomp-clomp of someone walking down. We completely panicked and bolted down the narrow staircase, back toward the cellar. In the chaos, my friend dropped his lamp. It crashed down the steps, the oil spilled, and it caught fire. We didn't stop or look back, just ran. The whole group sprinted across the field. Forgot to mention, this cursed place sat alone by the Thames at a disused dock and made it to the bus stop. A bus happened to be there, and we got on immediately. Once on the top deck, we looked back and saw smoke pouring out of the hotel. We all went home that night, terrified the police would knock on our doors since the building was listed and had historical value. The next day, we nervously returned to see what damage we'd caused, if the building was even still standing. To our total disbelief, it was untouched. Those stairs had definitely been on fire, and the building was mostly wood, over 100 years old, filled with trash. It should have burned down. I'm 54 now, and this remains the only thing in my life that has ever made me seriously consider the paranormal. We'd searched that building top to bottom. There was no one in there. The hotel has since been renovated and reopened. One day I should book a room on the third floor. Look it up on Google, especially the black and white photos of it before restoration. Galleons Hotel, Beckton, London. Story 29. When I was 5, my family moved into a new house, and I hated it. From the moment I saw it, I had this intense, fearful hatred of the place. I couldn't explain it, but I begged my parents not to move in. I pleaded with them not to make me sleep in the bedroom that was supposed to be mine. I even begged them to find any other house. I just felt that this one was bad. Whenever I misbehaved, I'd be put in time out. I usually didn't mind. It was peaceful, and at least no one was yelling at me. But if they told me to spend time out alone in my room, I would completely freak out. I would beg them not to do it because of the wolves. I would hear howling, growling, sniffing, and scratching. It sounded like it came from all the rooms upstairs at once, but never the room I was in. Sometimes I would sneak halfway down the stairs, so I'd be close enough to make a run for the living room before the wolves got me. I'd spend the whole punishment just staring at the top of the stairs, frozen in fear but ready to bolt. The kitchen had a single window over the sink, looking out onto the backyard. There was a creepy old shed to one side and what I used to call the forest at the back. My mom later told me it was just a line of trees separating our street from the next one. But in my memory, it's still a thick, endless forest. One winter evening, we were all home watching TV. I went to the kitchen to get a drink. I grabbed a cup, turned toward the sink, and saw a man staring at me through the window. Clear as day, he was old, bald, and had gray skin. He wore a tan-colored long coat with a large upright collar like a dress shirt. His expression was emotionless, just staring. I was frozen. I tried to scream, but all that came out was a whisper. I was stuck like that for what felt like forever. The old man, motionless, inches away from me, lit only by the kitchen light. I just stood there, whisper screaming, until I could finally shout for my mom. She came in, and the man didn't move. He didn't back away. He just slowly faded from sight. I was hysterical, yelling, "There's a man in the window. He's staring at me." My dad came in, picked me up, and tried to calm me down by showing me my own reflection. But the angle didn't make sense. I was shorter than the sink. I couldn't have seen my reflection. I insisted over and over. He was outside the window, right there, staring at me. My dad checked outside. Nothing. They tried to settle me for the rest of the night. Years later, I told this story again in front of my mom. She was stunned. I remembered every detail. She didn't know about the whisper screaming part because I never mentioned it then. Then she asked, "Do you remember the wolves?" I said yes. That's when she told me they got that house at a discount. It had belonged to a friend's parents. Her mother had died suddenly from a fast illness, and her father later died by suicide in the shed. The daughter wanted to sell the house as fast as possible, and my parents happened to be looking. So one of them died upstairs. The other in the shed. I was terrified of both. We only lived there for less than a year, and when we looked for a new place, my parents asked me at every house, "Does it feel like a bad house?" They ended up choosing the home they still live in today because 5-year-old me said, "This one feels good." Story 30. I lived on an old farm that had been in our family for generations. The fireplace had those glass doors stained with years of smoke. We lived in Texas, so we rarely used it, maybe once or twice a year during the holidays. I was about 6 years old, and I always had this feeling that something was staring out from behind that glass. I'd get goosebumps, and the hair on the back of my neck would stand up. I told my parents again and again that there was someone inside the fireplace. They brushed it off and just told me to pray. I refused to ever look directly at the doors. I knew that if I did, I'd see whoever or whatever was in there. Unfortunately, one night I decided to face my fears. I looked straight into the glass. What I saw was a small child, curled up behind the glass. Their skin was blue and ashen, their eyes sunken, their breath forming tiny puffs of cold air. They were sitting with their knees pulled to their chest, visibly shivering. I stood there frozen, feeling the chill creeping up my spine. The child slowly lifted a hand and placed it on the glass. I swear I could feel the urge to open the doors, like something was gently pulling me in. Before I could move, one of my siblings came running into the den, screaming about something unrelated. I snapped out of it, but I never saw the fireplace child again. No one believed me. They said I was being dramatic, but I still remember that face so clearly. I always felt it watching me, even after that night. Every time I got near the fireplace, I felt the same invisible pull, the same urge to open those doors. I've seen other strange, unexplainable things since then, but that was the first, and somehow it's still the one that haunts me most. Story 31. My parents live on a large rural lot, far away from anyone except for one neighbor. It's kind of like being out in the woods alone. In the winter, they go to Mexico to escape the cold in northern Canada, and back when I didn't have my own place yet, I used to stay at their house while they were away. One night during one of those stays, I woke up in the middle of the night with this sudden, unexplainable feeling that someone or something was inside the house. I checked the clock. It was around 3 a.m. I turned on the light and a cold shiver ran through me. I kept the bedroom door shut at night, especially since we had dogs, and I liked them sleeping in the room with me. All of a sudden, the dogs started growling, something they almost never did. Then they walked right up to the base of the bedroom door, where the small crack at the bottom was, and started growling and barking furiously at it. They kept barking for about 15 to 20 minutes, nonstop.